Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Johnson, and today, in conjunction with my classmate Elizabeth Muniz, we would like to highlight a couple of chapters from the Heppner text. The first chapter we want to highlight is learning from the richness of a sample size of one. Yes, we're talking about single subject design. But before we get into the different variations of single subject design, I would like to highlight a scripture reflection. Matthew chapter 18, verses 20, and it reads, "For where two or three gather in my name, there I am with them." And in reflecting on single subject design and looking at this scripture, it tells me a couple of things. With single subject design, the focus is on a small group of individuals or the individual themselves as we conduct research. And looking at this scripture, God tells me in this scripture that where two or more gather, there I am in the midst. So God is even there in the midst of the small sample, in the midst of the small group, in the midst of the sample size of one or two where we are conducting our research. So there is much to learn, much to gain, much to glean from our experiences, even in the small groups or small samples or the sample sizes of one. So, with single subject design, it has been considered unscientific and has not been extensively used within counseling research. Generally, they are longitudinal studies that include repeat observations or measurements of variables over time. Quantitative measures include categorical or ordinal or interval measurements. Qualitative measures include just the interventions with participants. And historically, there have been several research studies that spearheaded the use of single subject design within counseling research. The first type of single subject design we would like to talk about is the uncontrolled case study. It is considered the prototypical design of single subject designs. It includes observations of a client, dyad, or group under an unsystematic or uncontrolled circumstance. There are unplanned observations and or recollections of these observations within this particular design. The next design is the intensive single subject quantitative design. This includes a more systematic approach as compared to the uncontrolled case study design. It includes repeated or multiple observations of more clearly defined variables. So, whereas in the uncontrolled case study, there weren't any variables defined, but this particular design or quantitative design has more clearly defined variables. And this design evaluates both process and outcome data. So, we're not just looking at observations and finding what we find, we have a more systematic approach in what we're looking for using defined variables to evaluate the outcome and evaluate the observations and the measurements being used. The third type is the single subject experimental design, where it has that systematic approach like the intensive single subject design and the inclusiveness of using multiple measurements. This design has established treatment goals. So we're looking at specific goals that are established at the outset of the research design. And there are repeated measurements over time, and they also use baseline data to evaluate effectiveness of interventions and treatments. And there are various designs within this model, and we're going to highlight a few of them. The first is the A-B design. The A represents the baseline, and the B represents the treatment or the intervention. So a design could have a baseline data, and then it could have treat line data at multiple interval observation points. The ABAB design is where you collect baseline data, you implement the treatment, so that's the first B. Then you collect more baseline data, and then you also reinstitute the intervention. So within this particular design, you're giving treatment and then taking it away and then giving it back. With this design, there is the concern, along with the randomized AB design, the concern of withdrawing treatment at particular times. So you have to be very careful and very cautious of the type of research that you're doing and the type of interventions that are being placed upon individuals and situations. So with the randomized design, there is both phases repeated in more of a random fashion. So you could have a AABBB design or ABBB design. And so it's really random, and it can kind of control for any kind of learned or learned behaviors or learned traits as a result of the intervention being implemented to the individuals. You also have multiple baselines where you are collecting data on more than one dependent variable of the target behavior simultaneously. So with these particular designs, there are always some good and some bad, but not always so much ugly. So we're just going to highlight the good and the bad. So first, for the good, the positives are that it can assess therapeutic techniques and new methods that may be implemented or that want to be implemented within counseling research or counseling interventions. You can also study the individual themselves and study rare phenomena. So look at those extreme categories that you may or may not find in the larger studies. You can look at those extremes and really do some digging in and looking and seeing what you can glean from those experiences. You can also provide counter theories to already existing theories. So you may have a particular theory that has been established, well researched, and you could also look at these case studies or these single subject designs to disprove or add value to something that has already been looked at as a theory or looked at as an established theory over time. The bad thing about single subject designs is because the sample sizes are so small, it is difficult to generalize some of the findings. Especially in the uncontrolled case study, you have this lack of experimental control. With that lack of experimental control, some researchers look at these designs as being unscientific. And so you have all of this information about single subject designs. Hopefully one day you will be able to implement one of your own. So at this time, Elizabeth will come and share a little bit about chapter 15.
Today I'll be going over quantitative descriptive designs as explained in Heppner's chapter 15. Let's start now with survey research. The primary aim of survey research is going to document the frequency and nature of the studied variable. From there, our goals are going to be to describe, explain, or explore this in greater depth. I'm going to use the example of John Snow. John Snow lived in the 1800s and was a researcher who worked on the public health crisis caused by a cholera outbreak. During this time, it was unknown what was causing the outbreak and how to stop it. John Snow was able to identify that the cholera was being spread through water and sewer systems that were contaminated. From this, he was able to help the city address the public health crisis, as well as prevent future outbreaks of cholera during that time. There's a few things I'd like to mention that you would want to bear in mind if doing survey research. First off, it's important to have a defined population. If you are looking to use a small survey sample, be aware that the results of this survey may not be able to be generalized to a larger population. For example, if I'm studying students' love of the cold, I would need to expand my survey sample size beyond just students living in Minnesota or another cold state. I would need to include a larger geographical area so that my students would have some variety and potential change in their responses. Next, use random sampling. Some of the things that Heppner identifies in his book is the importance of identifying how you are administering your surveys and how that might limit certain people from accessing them. For example, if I'm putting different surveys, hard copy, in a college campus, the chances of my age group being broad are a lot more limited. Lastly, know your population. Some of the ways that this can be a problem is through translation work. There can be the actual translation process, which unfortunately is easy to mess up, as most translation is not quite straightforward. There can also be issues if you're asking things that are culturally inappropriate or sensitive that an individual might not want to answer truthfully or feel uncomfortable about. It's important when using a survey in a different culture that you're unaware of or population that potentially you're less familiar with, to work with individuals that would have a greater knowledge to help you understand what might need to change in your survey. To explain moderation and mediation, I'm using this image, and we'll use two examples borrowed from the Heppner chapter. Let's start with moderation. In this example, the predictor is life events. The criterion will be depression, and the moderator will be social support. A researcher might predict that negative life events or stressors are going to have an impact on depression, the criterion. However, if someone looks at individuals that have these negative life events or stressors, but also have the addition of social support or moderator, they may find that the criterion variable, your depression, is not as strong as otherwise would be. So again, in this example, we're looking at how the moderator is affecting the strength or direction of the predictor and the criterion variables. Let's look at mediation now. The mediator here is working with the predictor and the criterion. We'll have cognitive therapy be the predictor, which changes the client's thought process, which then enables them to gain therapeutic outcomes. In this way, we're able to identify how a mediator might affect how and or the why of an effect. The book also outlines that Barron and Kenny have criteria for mediation that is further elaborated in the chapter. Lastly, let's cover person-centered research. There are three types of person-centered research that the chapter covers: cluster analysis, latent class or profiles analysis, and growth mixture analysis. The goal of person-centered research is to explore groups of people that are either similar or different. Then, making comparisons across these groups. And lastly, analyzing heterogeneous groups. In this way, we can explore vast quantities of individuals, identify common strengths or weaknesses, and expound upon them to larger groups that we can then study. Let's spend a little time now looking at Christian integration and research. The first thing I've identified is know who you're studying. In the process of doing research, there's a balance of identifying individual characteristics and traits while also being able to identify common themes that can then be brought into larger people groups. One of the aspects that I like about research, though, is it can identify some of the differences. There's an intentionality that we have as Christians when we realize that God created different personalities and different people for a reason. Second, know what you're studying. By this, I'm talking a little bit more about the curiosity versus the causation. What I mean by that is there is an aspect of faith and understanding and desire to understand the world in which we live and that God has created that should foster curiosity in us. It's this curiosity that then encourages us to research and to know more about the world around us, rather than to see things and assume or want to have a definite answer by the end of X causing Y. It's this curiosity that allows us to realize that sometimes our initial hypothesis is wrong, and we need to identify and look at an area or topic in a new way. Lastly, know why you're studying. In the beginning of this, I identified Jon Snow in one of the examples. I love the example of Jon Snow because it shows that research done well can have an impact not only on us, but on the lives and the well-being of people around us. It is this work that fosters not only science, but humanity and our faith as well. Listed is the reference for the Heppner et al. Book in the 4th edition that was used in all these slides.